All right, ooh, even I'm tall for this. Hold on. Okay, hi. Welcome and thank you for being here. I'm gonna read something that I hope is not too long and horribly inappropriate because I wrote it a little while ago and you never know on the night of. That serves as an introduction. My name is Fiona. I run a program called Hard to Read and I'm very grateful and happy to be here doing a first event of 2022 and who knows, maybe the only one of 2022 because putting on live events is very hard. Right now, Chase Bell, who co-produced this event in bringing lots of ideas of who should read and who made the zines that are in your hands right now, is not here because they broke their ankle in 2 spots when there was so much ice out. So I believe Chase is listening on the radio right now. Sorry, Chase. All right. The Thursday before Halloween last year, I performed a reading at KGB Bar. I came in costume because that's what the flyer said to do and because I had a Halloween party to go to after. Glam at the Jane just around the corner from here. I dressed as Julianne Moore in the second half of Todd Haynes' 1990 film Safe, when she's at the healing retreat wearing 80s athleisure and a nasal tube to deliver oxygen, Kaposi sarcoma-like lesions on her otherwise bare face. My friend Stephen Mark Klein had died 3 days prior to my reading. He was 71, sick, uninsured, and chose to take his own life. Stephen was the 4th person in my life to die since early 2020. His was the only loss I knew how to deal with. My 2 younger friends who had passed were some of the most beautiful, inspiring, and original people I had ever met. All the adjectives, really, sexy, lovely, smart, funny, Both were queer among other realities, like being an artist or half black from a white, tight-knit neighborhood, our hometown of Ottawa, that can make life unjustly challenging. The 25-year-old was a suicide, the 35-year-old died in an accident. My grandmother and I were estranged. Oh, right, I had a note that I'm sorry, this is a personal essay. My grandmother and I were estranged. In her last letter to me, she had called me a whore. Blonde would suit your complexion better, she wrote. You're washed out, and what you put on the internet will follow you forever. From a young age, I adored my grandmother and understood she was some kind of evil. She was glamorous, the only femme in my family. A lifelong alcoholic and striking bitch, racist, classist, misogynistic, homophobic, and any other ist or ick she could mimic, my grandmother, Audrey Shade, was cunning, cruel, and chic. Skilled at word lashings and financial manipulation, she, a dedicated Republican, was the bad one, the family scapegoat whose cartoonish cruelty was used by other liberal and leftist adults in my family to bypass their own accountability, to distract from their contributions to an all-over noxious family matrix. My friend Stephen's death was different from the others in my life because he loved life so much and he died on his own matured terms. Born at the right time in the right privileged body to have his version of a blast in New York City, he did just that for 7 decades. In his 60s, he ran the best fashion blog of the fashion blog era. It was anonymous. I had written about Stephen in his blog a few times in my 20s. I thought he was hilarious and that his everyday throwaway shit talk should be archived. When I learned that he had died, I remembered I had an unpublished short story in my files that documented a dinner we had in 2013. I dug it up, edited it, and read it dressed as Julianne Moore in Safe. The place was packed. Waves of would-be attendees were turned away. None of my friends could get in. Violating fire regulations, the bouncer let people stand in the stairs outside of the bar, listening from a distance. I made this thick throng laugh at least 18 times. I've never experienced this in my life. Maybe twice a year I'll make someone genuinely laugh out loud. But here I had a whole bar and a staircase of people rolling in it. It was Stephen's shit talk that got them. I knew exactly how he had spoken it and could mimic his intonation. Art is over, cool is over, fashion is over, design is over, done, finished, the end, it happened, move on. That's not really how he said it, but he was a really funny person. The applause was outstanding. People brought me drinks after, bought copies of my book, told me that mine was the best reading of the night, da-da-da. I felt Stephen would be so proud of me and that I had done him justice. I was practically mute when he and I had first met, and now I was booming like the boomer man he was. I walked to the next event dressed as Julianne Moore in Safe. It was only October 28th, so costumes on the streets were scarce. Strangers smiled at me, looked me in the eye, and made room for me on the streets. At the party, I got more smiles and kind energy. I thought this was because people could sense my new loving grace. the spirits of Stephen and Sophie and Audrey and Julian and the real me emanating from me. Acquaintances and unknowns talked to me. I made them laugh. Hot girls danced with me and told me I was beautiful in the line for the bathroom. I was Stephen Mark Klein. I was Julianne Moore. I understood my practice better suddenly. I document real-life characters. I listen to them and set stages for them. That's what my first book did, and that's what Hard to Read is. I think this is our 87th event. I used to be ashamed of it. I thought it demonstrated my lack of creativity and character, but if it weren't for me, too few people would have gotten access to Stephen's genius. He ranted in the streets. He didn't document himself. So I'm feeling good. Death can be a celebration of life. Remembrance can guide us forward. On my subway ride home, I get more gentle smiles and accommodations. A month and a half later, I go to a holiday party of someone I've only met once. As it happens, a number of people there had been at the KGB reading. They tell me how great it was and how everyone thought I was really actually sick. My complexion is washed out naturally. My grandmother knew nothing hurts like the truth. I remembered that only 10% of the people at the reading had been in costume and that my costume was expertly executed. I had ordered medical equipment and Brandy Melville separates for it. I had emphasized my pallor by putting brown eyeshadow where concealer should be and vice versa, for my sores, red lipstick on my pimples. At the end of my reading, when the host asked me to tell the audience what my costume was, apparently those present were so relieved I wasn't very, very sick, they thought I had been the whole reading. Oh, I asked, did I get pity laughs? Thank you for the pity laughs. When Mary asked me to put a reading on in this context, looking back, the White Columns annual where one person exhibits what they saw the previous year. This is Mary Manning's perspective, floating like the social butterfly they are around New York and otherwise. I wanted to parallel the curatorial premise, but for writing. Had Sarah Schulman on the line, and when her schedule lined up with this exhibit, I was thrilled. Sarah Schulman has published at least 24 books by my count. 20? Well, I counted more, so maybe that's your next 4 books. Including last year's Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York 1987-1993, published by FSG and editor Jackson Howard. Other titles you might recognize include After Dolores, Maggie Terry, The Gentrification of the Mind, Conflict is Not Abuse, and The Cosmopolitans. Schulman's books are vital always, but especially in a moment like this, as they teach us about New York and the history of health and housing discrimination, about remembrance and resistance, and about community accountability and care, how to be with others through crisis and conflict, including the importance of understanding our political circumstances so we don't unduly blame each other for the pain we're going through. The deaths of so many loved ones of late has been challenging, and I know I'm not alone in that. This event is testimony to it. In the first half of tonight's program, we'll look back on 2021 by rereading great writers who died. In addition to my Stephen Mark Klein, who I just represented, we'll honor 5 more, beginning with the musician, journalist, and critic Greg Tate, represented by his friend Arthur Jafa, who's tuning in from France, maybe? Somewhere abroad. From California. Then we'll have poet and translator Alisha Mascarenhas reading passages by poet and artist Etel Adnan, followed by Iris Klein and Chris Kraus in remembrance of their husband at different times, the writer and editor and founder of Semiotext Sylvère Lotringer, followed by writer, comic, and critic Mire representing Bell Hooks. Did I say that name right? Oh, thank God. I didn't ask. I always ask before and I forgot. And finally, Thora Siemsen. Did I say that name right? I'm an asshole. Siemsen, okay. Reading Sophie lyrics. Joan Didion, Eve Babbitt, Giancarlo Di Trapano, Janet Malcolm, Dave Hickey, Desmond Tutu, Virgil Abloh, and Jenny Crane. These are just some of the other names we could have included. The second half of tonight's program will belong to Sarah Schulman, who is very much alive and here tonight, and who I hope isn't too offended by my KS Legion Halloween costume. And if you are, you're welcome to smack me, I'm sorry. Many of Sarah's books contend with HIV/AIDS and its effects on individuals, communities, politics, and city life. You all know Todd Haynes' Safe is said to be a fable about the AIDS crisis, right? Streaming of this film was way up in early COVID, so apparently now a Hollywood informant told me a famous Star Wars Black Swan actress has the rights to readapt Safe as a TV show with a contemporary spin. They're shopping for a spin right now. If anybody has one, I can put you in touch with the agents. What could it be? When asked for a year-end recap, Hannah Black wrote, in 2021, we learned things we didn't want to know about mass death, singular death, the weakness of affective ties, and the near impossibility of social transformation. This was an evil year. Let's never forgive those who made it so. It's such an accurate summation, and between our roster of rereaders and then Sarah, I think all of it will be addressed tonight. Tonight, maybe I'm starting to get over it, but for the last months of 2021 and the first of 2022, if you're not sick of time yet, I'm a Virgo, so there's lots of calendars inside of me. I was dogged by the last two things on Sarah's list the most: the weakness of affective ties and how they correlate with the near impossibility of social transformation. I don't know about you, but there are people I love and hate now, but love, who I can't be around at the present moment because our coping mechanisms trigger one another, or maybe it's that our personal crises feel totally irrelevant to each other given the sudden and extreme different ways this pandemic is affecting each of us. I'm not sure what's going on. If I did, it wouldn't be dogging me. I'm a cat. But I know I'm not alone in this. I'm hearing similar stories of interpersonal angst from peers near and far. It seemed like in 2021, a lot of people got on an individualistic trip. If there can't be structural change, let me at least change my life kind of thing. And the changes people sought for themselves, myself included, were often at odds with those of their intimates. And at the same time, we're all crunched, caught between a viral pandemic and a system that's forcing back to normal. So we get a rise in divorces and affairs, friend, family, and comrade breakups, mass career panic, relapses, and new addictions, whether to ketamine, therapy, TV. Fearful what will happen when the climate really tips. I know that was huge in people's mind last year and ongoing. This crisis is just going to keep coming. This is the rest of our lives. Many people I know are desperate to make as much money as fast as possible, and by whatever means. This is not necessary to it, but I wanted to drop it in. Have you noticed that many of the rich kids who amassed their wealth in the Trump and early COVID years are very into being rich again, luxuriating among each other exclusively and putting it on Instagram like it's 2013? Maybe that's a bubble trend, but in my bubble, that's happening. A fiction writer once told me that an efficient way to introduce a cast of characters is to have them go through the same thing together and show how each person reacts to that event. A cute friend said 2021 sucked because we all had such great expectations for it. Mass death, singular death, the weakness of affective ties, and the near impossibility of social transformation. I have no idea what the next years will bring, but tonight, in rereading brilliant writing, I think we might find clues into how we can find agency within whatever will be. Thank you for listening. A quick note that we have Sarah's books for sale, fundraising for Palestine Legal, and all the other titles, which represent different readers in tonight, are fundraising for Hard to Read's operational budget. How are we on time? Oh, really good. Okay. I think that's all from me.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Should I just start then?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to read something from my dearest friend in the world, Greg Tate, who just passed in December. I'm still in shock over it. I'm going to read from his collection of pieces that he wrote, mostly for the Village Voice, not totally, but mostly for the Village Voice. It's really interesting flipping through the book and just trying to, think through what I wanted to read. I mean, there's so many things, and I just we were so tight that I kind of remember, late 80s, early 90s when he wrote most of these pieces, and even just reading them just gives me a flashback, But I'm going to read one of my favorites, this piece he wrote in, I think, 83 maybe. 83. And if you don't know, this is the book again, Flyboy and the Buttermilk, Essays on Contemporary America by Greg Tate. And this is a piece he wrote about Cecil Taylor called Cecil Taylor's Monster Movie. And I'm going to see if I can do some of Greg's cadence. It's almost impossible, but I'm going to try. I like to think of Cecil Taylor as someone whose art pushes the question of Afro-American identity beyond the mortal ken. In this respect, he resembles Jimi Hendrix or the Bad Brains. And of course, I'm not alone. Betty Carter, for instance, once told me that Cecil's music was black was black because whatever thing it was black music was supposed to have. Cecil's didn't have it. I'm sorry. Betty Carter, for instance, once told me that Cecil's music was not black because whatever thing it was black music was supposed to have, Cecil's didn't have one. Now, for a substantial portion of Cecil's audience, the blackness or non-blackness of his thing is probably, perhaps even properly irrelevant. Only what keeps the subject at hand such a prickly matter is Cecil's own demand that his black thing be given its propers, not only through iconic identification with Horace Silver, Bud Powell, Monk, and Ellington, but through speech, dress, and mannerisms, which at times seem inherited from one of Miles Davis's former incarnations. Further confusing the issue for some is Cecil's apparently strange love for soul music and black social dancing. Why, just the other day, someone I know saw him dancing to Nasty Girl on Channel 31 and freaked. Adding to the confusion is the maestro's black code methodology, quote unquote, a cosmology with Cecil at its infernal core. Now, truth to tell, I find none of this odd at all. Recently, a brother told me he thought Cecil's identification with black pop was nothing more than a pretentious apology for his music, to which my response was like, hey man, Cecil knows what's hip. I mean, who's he supposed to identify with, Leonard Bernstein? Later, I realized that the prejudices I betrayed pairing Cecil off, even ironically, with Bernstein, the nerd. And intellectually, Cecil seems to have resolved the question for himself 25 years ago. As far back as 1958, he would tell Nat Hentoff, quote, everything I've lived, I am. I am not afraid of European influences. The point is to use them, as Ellington did, as part of my life as an American Negro, end of quote. Now go on with your bad self, Cecil. Someone once said that while Coleman Hawkins gave jazz saxophone a voice, Lester Young taught it how to tell a story. That is, the art of personal confession is one jazz musicians must master before they can do justice by their tradition. I couldn't relate to Cecil's music until I learned to hear the story he was shaping out of both black tradition and his complex, quote unquote, life as an American Negro, end of quote. The chapter on Cecil and A.B. Spellman's Black Music, Four Lives, attests to the maze of ambiguities. Solo, a record Cecil made May 29, 1973, in Tokyo at 2:30 a.m., makes this labyrinth lucid lyrical poetry. And poetry isn't a word I drop in here simply because I like the sound of it. Because to make sense of Cecil's music, you have to consider the ways he masks allusion to rhetoric. One reason I'm writing about a record 10 years old rather than reviewing Cecil's new record, Garden, as I'd originally intended, is that while I've heard solo stories so many times, I could recite chapter and verse, I realized Garden's 4 sides would require years of digging before I could hum a few bars. Solo is where I learned that Cecil's music does not speak only for itself. In Cecil's music, as in poetry, the game of illusion is played to give spiritual and historical resonance to a language of self-invention. Whether this is done consciously or instinctively doesn't matter in the end. What does matter is how one game playing nourishes both the poet's iconoclasm and his faith in holy tradition. 2 character traits essential to any people whose artists must invoke release, revolt, and remembrance to survive a culture dedicated to the disposable and dangerous, therefore, to those who love holding on to their own. Only here's where the responsibility of the Black artistry tradition becomes trickiest. Because for any Black person to get over in this country the way Mahalia Jackson sang about getting over, they have to learn to play the game without fouling out. And then even learn the handy trick of going out of bounds to bring the ball back into home court. To my mind, this is what Black avant-garde music is all about. And in this league, Cecil Taylor's got my vote for MVP any season. What I learned from the performance on solo may help explain why. The basic building blocks to many a Cecil Taylor solo performance or improvisation, improvised composition, are 2 types of motifs I'll label figure A and figure B. Figure A consists of randomly hammered discords which come off like a beginner's love, or maybe at best like 1930s monster movie music. Figure B is a variable speed tone spiral, usually shadowed by melodic variants. The figure I believe Cecil finds kind of romantic. I know I do. Initially, Cecil sounds these two figures out for their opposing emotional values. He also plays coy with them, like a child who's discovered that he can tease the cat with the goldfish bowl, reminding me more, in fact, of those manipulative scenes in monster movies where the thing grabs a girl. If Cecil's music were in fact a monster movie, I'd characterize figure A as the doctor makes the monster scene, and figure B as the doctor macks on the girl scene. What Cecil does besides dress up these two figurines and set them on collision courses that go off and speak in tongues. This scene is, of course, known as The Monster Speaks. On God, and the monster literally even sings. What this monster be saying can be as frightening or as fascinating as the scene in Blade Runner where the replicant tells his manufacturer, "I want life, fucker," before smashing his brains in like they ain't got nothing in them. To what degree you find this scene black humor or horror show depends on whether your heart is with the runaway slave or the slave master. Or in the case of Cecil's music, whether you find the technique he's using to wreak havoc on Western classical form blasphemous or some beautiful black magic. Perversely, it's possible to do both. Like the autoerotic replicant prior to Blade Runner, this scene was made into an entire movie. I Loved a Monster. In a way, this recurring drama helps explain why certain of those people build our blacks up only to shoot them down when they figure winning is too good for that no good nigga. Which brings us to the heretofore unmentionable figure C, a bluesy kind of gospel refrain Cecil likes to throw out every now and then. On guard and stepping on stars, he throws down on it. His way of saying, even though he's gone clear when he's out there whipping all this mumbo jumbo on those black and white keys to the castle, he knows he's still got to come back and taste those maggots in the mind of the universe, just like the rest of us, because ain't no rising above it all if you're black and knee deep in this shit here. Moreover, this being the case, you best keep the blues as near and as dear to your heart as your prayer book, which brings us strangely enough to the D and E sides of Cecil's thing. Now, the D side is best exemplified by Air Above Mountains, Buildings Within, a marathon 52-minute architectonic solo where Cecil designs a cathedral with one hand and hammers that sucker together with the other. Garden, by the way, offers three sides worth of these jackhammered monoliths, and Carlos Fuentes' El Señor Presidente never had it so mad. East side, Cecil takes place anytime he works in his ensemble context, unit structures, a calling together of the flock to chase the moneylenders out of the temple, or the L7 as the case might be. I tend to favor triagonal Cecil to Cecil the Pentagon, with the exception, of course, of the side two of Three Facets, where Shannon Jackson's backbeat gave CT goes Barrel House, and E and F of One Too Many Swifty Salty Swift, and Not Goodbye, with his blood-spurting Jimmy Lyons exorcism and tender violin piano duets, and Dark to Themselves, which unleashed David Ware upon us, and Akiskista, where Andrew Cyril banished Cecil to the nether depths, and Morgan's Motion, where Tony Williams puts the clutch on Cecil's motor, and Potts, which prefigured Miles' Nefertiti in its use of pulse and percussion, and Communication Number 11, where Cecil engulfs the entire jazz composer's orchestra with a tidal wave of his hands. And well, what I'm saying is, if I enjoy Cecil's solo stuff more than some of his other sides, it's because solo has such Debussyan decorum and Chopinesque restraint going for it, such Ellingtonian sweep and monkish symmetry, and such Worrellian grace noting and Theraconian movement. Not to mention a quality of calm and motion akin to Aikido that may say much about being black and by yourself in Japan at 2:30 in the morning, making music that does not speak for itself alone. Music that is in transmutation of virtuoso technique into articulate syllables and jabberwock in the same breath reminds me more of Spoonie G and the Treacherous Three strafing and swooping rap off the new rap language than any other music I can compare it to. If you think you'd like to be a more dramatic version of the saying Rush, check out Introduction to Z on Guard, or for that matter, Soul Sonic's First Wars. Same difference, 1983. Sorry about the reading, but it's really incredible stuff. As I've said a few times, I love this guy so dearly. I miss him incredibly, but you know, the work stands. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to share this with you guys. So, okay, thank you. Okay. I will. Okay. Bye-bye.
Did you need the sound back on the computer or no?
For later, yeah.
Okay, cool.
We'll have Alisha and Etel now.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. There's a lot that I could say about Etel and why I love the work that she brought into the world. But I'd like to start with a small text that I wrote, that I began to write when I learned of her death in November. And then I'm going to read one of her poems. The morning after your death, the news comes quick and bright as the sun. Flat light of November and the murmur of life all around. Leaves split and wither. We drink coffee and share an apricot pastry. I'm sitting with you the morning after my death, not having the means to feel any sorrow. We are joyful with you, crying with awe in this loss, Etel. You showed us totality, the inclusion of everything and everything. With your attention to the work of spirit, you knew how to reach within and towards life, how to be awake as a child to the phenomenal nature of being. You have helped us to continue to live our lives, never firm or stable. How exquisite and direct your transmissions. You have amazed us with your ability to be delighted, curious, and perceptive to beauty, showing us how poetry makes the erotic and the intellect meet. The writing that you have left us with makes it possible to recognize that which in feeling can be so totally bewildering and chaotic and incomprehensible. Your life's work transmits its truths across mediums, so sensitive to the sacred experience of existing in this world, being human in the brutal, extraordinary presence of the weather. And coincidentally, that text is going to be, I think, up at the Poetry Project in the newsletter today, online and then in print eventually. So I was first introduced to Etel's work through my friend and mentor, Sarah Riggs, who is also the translator of this collection called Time, which began as a correspondence of postcards between Etel and her friend Khaled, and was then translated from the French into English by Sarah. And I had the honor of helping Sarah with the sort of final revisions to the translation, so it's a text that's very close to me. And I'm going to read from the third poem in the book. It's called At 2 p.m. in the Afternoon. The sun came out at night to go for a stroll, and the divine crossed the room. The windows opened. Writing comes from a dialogue with time. It's made of a mirror in which thought is stripped and no longer knows itself. In Palermo, men are as strictly trained as horses, or else they have the shining violence of flowers. It's more bearable to think of death than of love. Greek thought explored all things the way it explored the islands. When men no longer have power over women, over whom will they have it? All Sicily is painted by the planting of vines. The shards of grief that a teapot transforms into inexpressible joy. The barberry figs ripen on brilliant mornings, with firm flesh, with certain steps. Limits everywhere. How to reconcile soul and body, what to do between two white sheets. She said, standing in the middle of her ranch, how black it is, eternity. On the other side of the street that separates him from the garden's splendor, Isa sits with a black coffee and talks about the mother whose brain invents aberration. Me, I'm sent back to the swamps in the darkness of my doubts. The curtain falls on a mass grave. The Babylonian gods now give birth only to cadavers. Philosophy is a non-knowledge. Thought takes pleasure in measuring its borders. The body is a sacred place because it bursts with life and lasts briefly. Time reminds me of these cemeteries in which mountains are devoured, enveloped in their mist. The cock crows, the dog barks, the cat climbs a tree. Above the clouds and before the moon, ideas drift. And then the boats keep returning to the port, corn goddesses protecting them. Shakespeare's will, written on a piece of yellowed paper, was handed to me one night in London when I was stricken with hunger. Over there, there's nothing but rising paths, a naked horse, clumps of grass, wind. The permanent eclipse is expected. It seems far in time, but quite close in thought. The spider waited a long time, but the fly eventually came. And heat, what can we say to it? Talk to it about the cold, too late. About the river, this one is dry. Of love, it is the most obvious shape of it. The season passes a rapid hand through the trees. Don't believe the wind is absent-minded, that sleep is guaranteed. You say that the trains went too fast, but your madness raging over my body, was that nothing? Time can't be translated. Your voice in my veins grows its poisonous plants. Roses are watered by the black storms of our desire. The loved one won't go to the night palace where women and wine are waiting. So we don't speed up the illness. We pretended not to love ourselves, knowing anyhow the days would not come back. And then to close, just as I was kind of going through my different Etel books, trying to find what to read, I came across this tiny poem that I wrote on the 3rd of February in 2018 while in the process of editing this book, so I wanted to read it for you. So it kind of comes out of at 2 p.m. in the afternoon with a little piece from Etel's original French, which goes like this. L'écriture résulte d'un dialogue avec le temps. Elle est fabrication de miroirs dans lesquels la pensée se dépouille et ne se reconnaît plus. It comes rushing in the morning, the light, an empty wall, breaking through the unsaid. My desire, a precarity. We are swimming, willful, swallowed up, salt heavy. At 2 o'clock in the morning, one long, jagged coast, traced out with my mind from point to point, a line, a longing between beaches. Thank you.
Now we'll play a video of Iris Klein and Chris Kraus. Iris will introduce Chris, who is going to read from a work of Sylvère's that he was working on in his last months.
Hi. In 2006, an Austrian friend, the curator, author, and thinker Katrin Pichler, asked Sylvère if he could contribute an essay to a collection of texts that revolved around a letter exchange between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. Sylvère did so, taking Freud as a springboard to his own memories. More than a decade later, he went back to this text, expanding and changing it to become a personal memoir. Un homme qui dort, a man who sleeps, is the title of a book by Georges Perec and an allusion to a well-known sentence at the beginning of La Recherche by Marcel Proust. Sylvère exchanged the word sleep to slip to play on a Freudscher Versprecher or Freudian slip. And now, without any Austrian accent to distract, here's Chris reading an excerpt.
Hi. I'm going to read from a piece called The Man Who Slipped, which is one of the last things Sylvère was working on before he died. And this is just a short fragment from it. Freud was interested in crime, but in more lay terms. He lectured Viennese jurists and criminologists alike about interrogation techniques. An analyst, he claimed, is no different from an examining magistrate. Had he worked for the Secret Service during World War II, he would have broken enemy codes and saved the Jews like Moses. His ultimate enemy, though, was monotheism, which he preferred calling the unconscious. Freud was a private eye like Oedipus. He was always eager to solve self-created riddles and offer them as cultural truth. More a cryptanalyst than an analyst, he relished interpretation far more than he did dreams. And yet he owed them his reputation. They may have been overrated. I often called a friend of mine, Francois P., a Lacanian psychoanalyst in Montreal, forgetting that he was a patient. And Francois would softly answer on the phone, "Oh, Sylvère, I'm so glad you called. I was falling asleep. This patient has been telling me about her dream over the last few weeks, and I knew that we'd be wasting our time. She doesn't want to do the work." Dream work is not what it used to be. These days, it may simply be meant to keep the analyst off track. It all depends on the dream, of course. Those begging to be interpreted make me a bit nervous myself. I prefer simple one-liners that can get your head spinning. Dreams can be far more real than real life. In Ecuador, I crossed the infested Amazon in a narrow Indian pirogue, but I have never been eaten alive by piranhas as I did in one of my dreams, in which they tore my body into shreds. I could never be the same after that. Even plain dumb dreams that mean nothing may have lasting effects. In September 1987, driving back to New York City to start my classes, I felt I was choking on the wheel. I was admitted to the emergency room in Glens Falls Hospital in upstate New York. They found that the envelope of my heart was 20 times the normal size. No wonder I was suffocating. That was a lot of heart for one man. Glens Falls was a provincial hospital. They had no bed in cardiology, so they moved me to the cancer ward. I arrived there just in time to hear the doctor break the news to my roommate that he had terminal cancer. The doctor had just pulled a thin curtain between his patient's bed and mine, and I could hear his voice spelling out softly the man's options: chemo, radiation, etc. I felt he was signing our death warrant. That night I had the most cheerful dream, quick-paced, light-hearted, colorful, the kind of breathless plot that drives Truffaut's film Shoot the Piano Player, one of my all-time favorites, to its melancholy conclusion. I still remember every bit of the dream as if I had hallucinated it. And maybe I did. They had given me a hefty dose of morphine. The dream had nothing to do with me. Maybe it was the monitor my roommate was kept plugged into 24/7 in order to dull his anguish that fed directly into my drip. A horrible nightmare would have been in order, but in fact I was being entertained in my sleep. Maybe the idea of death coming so close was liberating, even uplifting in a strange kind of way. There was nothing more to fear. It is not that I get afraid so easily. I am never afraid of something. Before I left France, I had a close friend, Henri M. When we were 16, he told me he had no idea what guilt was. And this made perfect sense to me when I thought about it later on. Because you see, he was all guilt. He didn't have the distance. Fear is no different. You don't even know it's there, so you keep challenging it. Georges Perec, who lost his parents during the war as a child, volunteered to the French paratroopers in 1958 during the Algerian War. He wanted to jump from a plane. The only analyst I ever trusted, a stocky middle-aged woman in Los Angeles, not especially athletic, not a great psychiatrist either, was parachuting on the weekends. She didn't have to tell me more. Her father had left her as a baby in front of a convent in Warsaw after he realized the Jews didn't have a fighting chance. It helped me understand something of my own reactions. I always light up in life-threatening situations, never quite understand why. It's as if I've been rehearsing them my whole life.
We'll let Iris stay with us. Muna and Belle are next.
So I'm going to be honoring Bell Hooks tonight, and I'm going to be reading from her 1999 book, All About Love. And the chapter I chose to read is the 11th chapter, which is entitled Loss, Loving into Life and Death. Bell Hooks' work has been sort of an intervention and a guide for me throughout my life. She loved Black women. She simply loved Black women. And the reason I chose this chapter is that it lands on something I find to be like the kernel of her life's work, which is the love ethic. And here I want to paraphrase from an LA Review of Books piece from Joy James and a couple of other, Gloria Steinem, some other people memorializing Bell Hooks. So when she speaks to dying, she speaks to a process of emptying oneself, a process of self-emptying. And that process captures the sort of political, educational, spiritual, and interpersonal core of Hooks's work. It speaks to a form of dying of aspects of the self that sustain violence and forms of toxic divisiveness. Dying within this context speaks to radical transformation, generative opening, self-forgiveness, the forgiveness of others, and a powerful sense of letting go. And the authors here point to The fact that Belle was born Gloria Jean Watkins in 1952, and the choice to take the name Bell Hooks as a sort of self-emptying. So yeah, this is the 11th chapter of All About Love, Loss, Loving into Life and Death. Love makes us feel more alive. Living in a state of lovelessness, we feel we might as well be dead. Everything within us is silent and still. We're unmoved. Soul murder is the term psychoanalysts use to describe this state of living death. It echoes the biblical declaration that, quote, anyone who does not know love is still in death, unquote. Cultures of domination court death. And here I think we can also think of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, which is the meting out of premature death by the state. Cultures of domination court death, hence the ongoing fascination with violence, the false insistence that it's natural for the strong to prey upon the weak, for the more powerful to prey upon the powerless. In our culture, the worship of death is so intense it stands in the way of love. On his deathbed, Eric Fromm asked a beloved friend why we prefer love of death to love of life. Why, quote, the human race prefers necrophilia to biophilia. Coming from Fromm, this question was merely rhetorical, as he had spent his life explaining our cultural failure to fully embrace the reality that love gives life meaning. Unlike love, death will touch all of us at some point in our lives. We will witness the death of others, or we will witness our own dying, even if it's just in that brief instance when life is fading away. Living with lovelessness is not a problem we openly and readily complain about. Yet the reality that we will all die generates tremendous concern, fear, and worry. It may very well be that the worship of death, indicated by the constant spectacles of dying we watch on television screens daily, is one way our culture tries to still that fear, to conquer it, to make us comfortable. Writing about the meaning of death in contemporary culture, Thomas Merton explains, quote, psychoanalysis has taught us something about the death wish that pervades the modern world. We discover our affluent society to be profoundly addicted to the love of death. In such a society, though much may be officially said about human values, wherever there is, in fact, a choice between the living and the dead, between men and money, or men and power, or men and bombs, the choice will always be for death. For death is the end or the goal of life, unquote. Our cultural obsession with death consumes energy that could be given to the art of loving. The worship of death is a central component of patriarchal thinking, whether expressed by women or men. Visionary theologians see the failure of religion as one reason our culture remains death-centered. In his work, Original Blessing, Matthew Fox explains, quote, Western civilization has preferred love of death to love of life to the very extent that its religious traditions have preferred redemption to creation, sin to ecstasy, and individual introspection to cosmic awareness and appreciation, unquote. For the most part, patriarchal perspectives have shaped religious teaching and practice. Recently, there's been a turning away from these teachings towards a creation-grounded spirituality that is life-affirming. Fox calls this the via positiva. Without this solid grounding in creation's powers, we become bored, violent people. We become necrophiliacs in love with death and the powers and principalities of death. We move away from this worship of death by challenging patriarchy, creating peace, working for justice, and embracing a love ethic. Ironically, the worship of death as a strategy for coping with our underlying fear of death's power does not truly give us solace. It is deeply anxiety-producing. The more we watch spectacles of meaningless death, of random violence and cruelty, the more afraid we become in our daily lives. All the worship of death we see on our television screens, all the death we witness daily does not prepare us in any way to face dying with awareness, clarity, or peace of mind. When worship of death is rooted in fear, it does not enable us to live fully or well. Merton contends, quote, "If we become obsessed with the idea of death hiding and waiting for us in ambush, we are not making death more real, but life less real. Our life is divided against itself. It becomes a tug of war between the love and fear of itself. Death then operates in the midst of life, not as the end of life, rather as the fear of life. To live fully, we would need to let go of our fear of dying. That fear can only be addressed by the love of living. We have a long history in this nation of believing that to be too celebratory is dangerous, that being optimistic is foolhardy, hence our difficulty in celebrating life, in teaching our children and ourselves how to love life. Many of us come to love life only when faced with life-threatening illness. Certainly, facing the possibility of my own death gave me the courage to confront the lack of love in my life. Much contemporary visionary work on death and dying has highlighted learning how to love. Love makes it possible for us to change our worship of death to a celebration of life. In an unsent letter written to a true love in my life, I wrote, quote, "During the memorial service for her sister, my friend gave testimony in which she declared, quote, 'Death has left us loving her completely,' unquote. We are so much more able to embrace the loss of intimate loved ones and friends when we know we have given our all, when we have shared with them that mutual recognition and belonging in love which death can never change or take away. Each day, I'm grateful for having known a love that enables me to embrace death with no fear of incompleteness or lack, with no sense of irredeemable regret. That is a gift you gave. I cherish it. Nothing changes its value. It remains precious. Loving does this. Love empowers us to live fully and die well. Death becomes then not an end to life, but a part of living. This deathbed recognition of love's power is a moment of ecstasy. We would be lucky if we felt its power all our days and not just when those days are ending. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna. Our final rereader before Sarah Schulman takes the stage is Thora, reading Sophie lyrics. And Sophie always said we would do an event together, but we didn't get to, so this is my version of that.
That's fine, right? It's okay. I can.
You manage?
Yes.
You can also take it out.
I'll take it out.
Not my day job.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Thora, and I am going to read lyrics to a song by my late friend Sophie that many of you will probably recognize. And seeing how loved she is makes me feel her here. And thank you for asking me to do this, Fiona. Sophie loved you, and I'm honored to read with heroes, and what a lovely night. Thank you. We were young and out of control. I haven't seen you since I was about 16 years old, but then you called me up the other day. I was shocked, but what could I say? And your voice exactly the same, and it makes me feel just like we never said goodbye when you spoke to me in that way. We went out the very next day. You still remember my favorite place, and we laughed just like we used to and did everything we like to do. And now we're holding hands and running. And it makes me feel just like we never said goodbye when you looked at me that way. We were young. We had everything we wanted, running wild through the night. We were young. We had everything we needed. And I see that now that you're here with me, I've got everything that I could ever need. And it makes me feel just like we never said goodbye when you held my hand in that way. I still got that glint in your eye, like you did the very first time. It's like we never said goodbye, and it makes me feel like everything that I could ever need, and it makes me feel like I don't ever want to say goodbye.
Is this the right height for you?
Yeah, yes. Hi, everyone. What incredible readings. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thora, where are you? Thank you so much. And Fiona, such astute curation. It's kind of incredible. But, you know, the theme is really our dead friends in a lot of ways. First of all, I want to thank Matthew because it's been 10 years that you've been supporting this work on ACT UP, and I really appreciate the consistency. And thank you to my editor, Jackson Howard, for working on a 750-page book, Beyond the Call of Duty. Okay. This is the story of a despised group of people with no rights, facing a terminal disease for which there were no treatments. Abandoned by their families, government, and society, they joined together and forced our country to change against its will, permanently impacting future movements of people with AIDS throughout the world and saving incalculable numbers of future lives. Some men and women with AIDS fought until the day they died. The dead and the living ultimately transformed the crisis. This is an apocalyptic story of the first generation of AIDS activists who experienced the virus in a way that no subsequent generation would ever have to experience it again. For some, their days, months, and years in ACT UP were the most important times of their lives. For others, it was a chapter in a series of contributions. Some people went on to find a place in the world. Some lost their place forever. But because of commitment and brilliance, only these survivors carry the burden of the first years of the mass death experience that was AIDS. They made the world better to some degree for every subsequent HIV/AIDS generation that is the future. This is a story that should have been impossible, which is why it is crucial for us now to understand how and why it happened. These were the people least likely to make substantive change, participating in the broadest possible coalition, most of whom in some or all aspects of their lives were excluded from basic rights. As Dudley Saunders points out, in a way, the win obscured the process, one that we need to learn from right now. And our distorting cinematic concepts of what constitutes heroism have also made it impossible to look at the flaws clearly, as well as at their consequences. Understanding mistakes does not undo successes. Learning to hold both at the same time is necessary in order for new generations of people under attack to feel capable of moving forward. Now, although the story of AIDS activism is one of heroism, it actually starts in suffering. AIDS without medication is a grotesque display of loss. Every faculty disintegrates: the brain, the lungs, the nerves in one's legs, the ability to control shit, the tongue covered in thrush, the broken skin. Even the normally unconsidered capacity to swallow and then to retain nutrition disappears. The body is no longer a mystery of synchronicity. It is a trap of literal pain and confusion, but also of social isolation. The diarrhea machine, the literal scarlet letter of cancerous Kaposi sarcoma eating away one's face, torso, legs, and arms, the rambling dementia, the shooting flames of neuropathy, making walking impossible or a horrific ordeal. Even the fungal toenails don't usually allow someone to make new friends. With the lack of treatment and services also came the abandonment by family if they hadn't already thrown you out or driven you away for being queer. Life was surrounded by death. There was the systematic loss of the friends who were your support network and the witnesses to your life, the deaths of whom became the end of context and memory. There was the loss of jobs, the end of careers, the disappearance of income, the losing of your apartment, the stares on the street, the shunning by neighbors, acquaintances turning their backs. But surprisingly, while many people joined ACT UP New York to end their own suffering, others came to confront someone else's pain. ACT UP was simultaneously a place of decline and a place of defiance of loss. Every Monday night, those few hundred people entered the ground floor meeting room at the crumbling old school that had become the gay center, then the lesbian and gay center, and now the renovated corporate lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community center on West 13th Street, next to the disappeared St. Vincent's Hospital to the east and across from the still present Integral Yoga Institute to the north. They came to save lives with humor, commitment, profound innovation, genius, will, and focus, and sometimes wild acting out, ruthlessness, and chance. But that meant that they also came to die and to watch disintegration, because to make something better, we have to face it at its worst. And only a small group of people on this earth are willing to look pain in its real face, assess it accurately, listen, and then criticize themselves with rigor, find a productive way to cooperate, and rise to the occasion to solve a problem. People who are desperate are much more effective than people who have time to waste. So I wanted to just read something from a person who died, John Greenberg. So ACT UP was founded in 1987, and 1980, and they made a lot of progress in terms of forcing the creation of certain kinds of treatments. But by 1992, it was pretty dismal out there, and people were dying very rapidly inside the organization, and we were all very young. I mean, when AIDS was first acknowledged, I was 23. I'm 63 now. So that's 40 years ago. But, you know, we watched each other fall apart, and there was an affinity group called the Maries. And there were 3 guys in the Maries who knew that they were going to die. Their names were Mark Lowe Fisher, Tim Bailey, and John Greenberg. And so they decided that they wanted their deaths to be political funerals. And they made the other Marys promise that when they died, there would be political funerals. So when Mark Lowe Fisher died, the Marys carried his body up Fifth Avenue to George Bush's campaign headquarters. When Tim Bailey, who was the menswear designer for Patricia Field, when he died, he wanted his body thrown on the White House lawn. So the Marys actually put his body in a van and drove to Washington, D.C. But when they got there, ACT UP was heavily infiltrated by the NYPD and the FBI. And actually, at the end of my book, I have the police files that prove that. But they already knew that ACT UP was coming, so the police were waiting, and they tried to take Tim's body. And there's actually footage in our film, United in Anger, where you can watch ACT UP people grabbing the casket back from the Washington police. So that was that. And then John Greenberg was the final one, and he was someone who believed in non-toxic treatments. So he was an alternative and holistic activist. And when he died, we took his body from Redden's funeral home on 14th Street, which was the only funeral home that would take people with AIDS, and brought it to Tompkins Square Park and opened the coffin and sat there, and we had a funeral for him in public with an open casket. Now, at his funeral, a friend of his, Barbara, produced a document that John had written for Mark's funeral, but he had been too upset to be able to read it. So Barbara read that eulogy at John's funeral, so I'm just going to read you a few paragraphs of that. Okay, so this is John Greenberg's eulogy for Mark Lowe Fisher, read at John's funeral in Tompkins Square Park. Mark has once again crossed a boundary that each of us will sooner or later have to cross, whether we have AIDS or not, whether we are angry or not, whether we are afraid or not, and whether we have a Republican president or not. The truth is that each of us will one day follow Mark to that ultimate otherness and the final liberation. Let us hope that we can do it as consciously, actively, and as well prepared as Mark has. To the end, Mark was unafraid of the consequences of his actions, or, if afraid, he used that fear to propel him onward rather than to paralyze him and stop him from fully living. Mark knew he was going to die. We, each of us, will also die. Mark's life and death, if it is to mean anything, cannot be trivialized by wishing it away or pretending that there could be any other end. Yes, we are in pain. We have lost a precious, powerful friend and colleague, but to avoid that pain by blaming it on someone else robs us of our opportunity to experience and learn from a greater consciousness, a larger self, a fearlessness. Acceptance of our mortality, as Mark accepted his, makes it possible to live life fully in spite of our fear. Makes it possible to live life in real freedom because we are not afraid of the consequences of our actions. It is only after we see how trivial and illusory the political, social, religious, and physical barriers of this world are that we can begin to liberate ourselves from our fears and find our true power, consciousness, action, and fearlessness. Mark was honest with himself and with his life. He knew his death was unavoidable. He knew that to believe otherwise was to believe a lie and to give more power to the fear of the unknown than to the courage, strength, and love that we can choose to face the unknown with. And Mark chose this action today as his memorial, making even his death an act of empowerment for his community and giving each of us an opportunity to publicly declare our presence, our pain, our right to life, and our right to be proud of our deaths. We can learn from Mark's death, learn about consciousness, empowerment, fearlessness, and action, and follow his lead as I followed him almost 2 years ago. Goodbye, Mark, and thank you for this final act of empowerment and generosity. Mark's final entry into his medical journal was, "Mind is clear. Feel like a connected whole." We honor that connected wholeness in our actions today. Thank you. Okay, what do you want to do, Fiona?
Well,
I'll grab these stools, and maybe you can hold the mics.
this one's not really working. So, I'm very encouraging of audience questions. Chase and I prepared a number of them in case y'all are shy, because that happens often at this type of thing with these types of groups. But I'll kick it off with one that Chase prepared, and then my work's miking. And then if you have a question, you'll have to come up because this mic has a short thread, so that means you're on camera. So you have to do two things, which is a lot. Anyway, sorry. Thank you, Sarah, for being here and reading that. This question comes to you from Chase. So I just read After Dolores, and something I kept thinking about was these moments of contact the narrator has with strangers giving money. After Dolores is one of Sarah's novels for people.
1988, people. It's old.
Yeah, Sarah, Chase has been reading all your fiction. Okay. So in After Dolores, the narrator has contact with strangers she gives money to, people in the park, people that frequent her job, and coworkers, and how the narrator is so aware of the backgrounds these people come from, however, it doesn't keep her from making contact. Chase asks, how have you thought about the negative and positive contact, in terms of your fiction and nonfiction? It's kind of a conceptual question. Yeah. That's a conceptual question. Chase was thinking about, at the moment, how the pandemic has associated contact with contact tracing, contracting the virus, and how there's such negative connotations. But then there is positive contact, like connecting with your neighbors to build a rent strike this night. I know that's a big question.
I mean, the one question I can't answer is what's the relationship between the fiction and the nonfiction?
Oh, that was the next question
idea.
Chase had.
Oh, okay. That I have no answer to. But, I'm like a real New Yorker, so I talk to the person next to me on the subway, in the elevator, like that. So it's just because we live in front of each other here, right? We live in public space, and so I think it's, it's nice to make contact. It's the way we do things.
Right.
Yeah.
Really? So someone else is going to have to write the thing about what's the relationship between
There's
your fiction
no
and
answer.
nonfiction. There's a lot of answers, but it's not necessarily for you to answer. I'm sure there's an academic essay I could read right now. Given that this is a looking back exhibit, I was wondering how the last year was for you.
Fine. I've done okay. The hardest thing is, I teach at the College of Staten Island, which is a CUNY campus. And teaching remote to poor people, it doesn't work. A lot of my students don't have computers, they don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have their own rooms. So they have their kids on their laps, or their parents are sitting next to them, and they really couldn't learn. I mean, it was really ridiculous. So remote does not work in the public sphere, is my conclusion. Yeah.
That's why we chose not to Zoom fully tonight. We're streaming on the radio. Give someone a relief from Zoom. So I want to talk a little bit about the ACT UP book. And if anyone, just next we'll have an audience question, so get ready, brace yourselves. In the beginning of Let the Record Show, there's a passage where you're wondering about what made certain people join ACT UP, which I really liked. You're completing an oral history of the movement, or you did this earlier, and through the interview process, you're wondering if you'll find some sort of experiential or cultural reason why this relatively diverse group of people joined forces and gave so much, sometimes even when they weren't directly personally affected by HIV/AIDS. You're wondering, was it an early childhood? I'm giving you a sense of the book also. Was it an early childhood experience with illness? Was it activist parents? And you're finding that stuff in different people's lives, but it's not across the board. And what you finally write, which I think maybe relates to fiction writing, is that it has something to do with their character, and you could call it their nature. There's just some people who can't stand by during a crisis or a tragedy, and they're compelled to help. And this rings very true to me, and you could say the same about artists. There's just some people who are artists and going to be. So my question isn't so much about that, unless you want to expand on it, but more so about how people stay doing it after being called to it. And Muna's Bell Hooks reading sort of is one answer to that, and the eulogy you just read is also kind of one answer, but I'm wondering how you've persevered and the different characters in your book persevere. What are some common habits or coping mechanisms or character traits of people who persist?
Well, I think you have to have wins. I think victories are very important, and we're in a very retrogressive time right now, and it's easy to be frustrated. But one lesson of this is that it's very hard to get access to information about how activist movements have actually functioned, because that information is so misrepresented, and if you go through the official archive, you're going to come out the wrong end. Like, this is a movement I was in. I've covered AIDS since it started. It's like, 40-year period, and you can't do that for every movement. I mean, you don't have, there aren't insiders who have the opportunity and privilege to do that. So I think that we have to imagine that there's a huge amount going on and we don't know what it is. And I think if you look at some of the movements that we have now, the movements against police violence, the movements for Black lives, if you're in every city in this country, there are local organizers who are doing work in those localities, who are either opposing municipalities, working with municipalities. We don't even know the names of these leaders, but they're out there, you know, so don't think that nothing's happening, right? That's the first thing. But I think one of the lessons of ACT UP is that we have to design the solutions. If we get into infantilized relationships to power, where we're begging the powers that be to fix everything, they're not going to do it. They don't know how, and they don't want to. And so we have to design solutions that are reasonable, winnable, and doable. And this can be done by focus. You can do it with a small group of people and run campaigns towards this solution, towards letting the public understand what this solution is and putting pressure on the powers that be. And when you start to accrue wins, even if they're small, it trains you to be a better organizer. It trains you to understand how to achieve it and attracts other people to your group. And I think that that's what we can do right now. You know, so I have a lot of theoretical ideas about people and about society, but I'm not theoretical when it comes to politics. I like action and concrete goals that make people's lives better. And it's just like, I'm a romantic, but not about art, for example. So, you know, we can have different kinds of reactions to different moments.
Does anybody have a question? Yes. Mary, can you use the microphone so that the radio people can hear you?
You're the curator of the show, right? Oh, congratulations.
Thanks so much. I'm a huge fan of the film that you produced, United in Anger. And I don't know how many of you follow Sarah on Twitter, but you tweeted that you had shown this film to your students and at Staten Island, and I wondered if you could just talk to the crowd about that experience, because it was really interesting.
So this is a film called United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, that you can watch for free, because we make all our stuff available. If you go to actuporalhistory.org, you can watch all the videos. You can see our archive of the Latino caucus of ACT UP. You can link to United in Anger. It was directed by Jim Hubbard, and we co-produced it. And so, you know, when we made this film in 2012, we literally took it all over the world. We showed it in Brazil and India. We went to Russia just a few weeks after the anti-gay laws were passed. We showed it in Palestine, in Lebanon. There are people with AIDS all over the world, right? And we were showing this film. And in the recent years, I began to feel like this was very ancient history. You know, everybody's got their 80s haircuts and all that kind of stuff. But when I showed it to my students last week, it felt like today. Because everyone now knows what the CDC is, what the NIH is, what the Food and Drug Administration is. Everyone knows that we don't have health care in this country. Everyone knows about pharmaceutical greed. Because just when AIDS drugs were finally created, drugs that worked, pharma's greed kept them from people who needed them because they wanted to maintain their profit. And here we are with vaccines that work, and poor countries can't get them. We're in the exact same mode that we were in then. And, you know, and one of the thoughts I've had in looking at this repeat is that these campaigns for national health care are very limited. We need international health care. We need global health care so that every person on earth has access to the standard of care. There's so much violence that's taking place on borders now. There's more refugees in the world than there's ever been. And we're seeing this rise in nationalism in the US and abroad. And so, you know, we really have to think internationally. So it's one of the ironies of ACT UP that is really underlined by the COVID crisis is that we could beat HIV, but we didn't beat capitalism. And, you know, that's our obstacle.
I've never heard someone suggest international health care. Is there anyone working towards that?
I don't know. I don't know if anyone is. I mean, It's an old communist concept.
Right,
But,
international.
Yeah.
Damn. Any other questions? Come on. All right.
I will tell you that 37 years ago, I worked one block from here at an all-women's trucking company on Gansevoort Street that delivered gay male pornography in pink postal trucks. And actually, my novel here, The Cosmopolitans, is set on that block in 1958. So, anyway.
That's a good pitch. Buy a book, and they're fundraising for Palestine Legal, and they'll be here after this event, so people who are listening can come visit the exhibit at White Columns and pick a book, and we'll sell them and keep raising the money and make a donation at the end. None? That didn't inspire? Okay. Matthew, thank you.
So my question is that, one of the notable things about ACT UP in its early years was it had quite a close relationship with the art community at that time. And I was just curious, from the position of 2022, how does protest, ACT UP, activism, those kind of narratives, how do they function in relation to the cultural world now? Is it different?
I actually don't know the answer to that because I'm not in the art world right now, but I will tell you that AIDS was so desperate and the suffering was so acute that one of the things that happened was that it was really no more business as usual, but for real, because you had to give up ambition. And in order to be effective as an AIDS activist, you were opposing not only the US government and pharmaceutical companies, you were opposing art museums and the New York Times. So if you're opposing the New York Times, you're not going to get a job at the New York Times. Do you know what I'm saying? So people kind of gave that up. And letting go of that wish to play it both ways, which ultimately doesn't work, is one of the reasons that it was successful. Now, there were consequences because when the good drugs came in, the protease inhibitors in 1996, there were people who thought they were going to die, and then they didn't die. And their finances were in shambles, their careers were in shambles, and some people never recovered from that. So there was a price, but career, and I've had a very long and ornery career, it really challenges you at every turn because if you're doing anything that matters, you're constantly obstructed. And, I've managed to hang in there, but you're up against a system, and it's an apparatus, and it's a machine, and it's made up of individuals, but they're part of corporations. And if you're an artist, your power is just you. And once you sell that, you never have it again. So, that's just something that each person has to decide for themselves.
Hi, I'm Steven. Nice to meet you, camera and world. So I wrote something down that I think was from your reading that said something about desperate people are much more likely to change than people that have time to waste. I think that was from your reading, maybe? Was that from your? Okay, I was getting a little jumbled, but I wrote it down and I was like, that really resonated with me. And so I was wondering what, for you, having been part of something that had so much longevity, what has brought you hope over time? And if it's been one thing specifically or many things over the years, but within your work, what has brought you hope?
I wouldn't call it hope. It's like, I don't want them to win. So the more I'm opposed, the more ingenious I become. And I think if I ever had the smooth path, I really don't know what would happen, to be honest. But that's what's driven me since the beginning of my life. Yeah.
That's a good answer. Anybody else? I had one question, another one. And it relates to what Matthew was, or there's a segue from Matthew in that even your reading demonstrated the artist's involvement in an ACT UP probably resulted in very, very creative demonstrations, like conceptually really brilliant ones. And he was using strategies based on specific needs and a lot of research. And you talk about it also being a multi-pronged, many-armed organization. If people wanted to do something, they would do it. It didn't have to be united, which reminded me they could be united in what their overall intention was, but there could be little factions doing different projects. And there's a Florence Kennedy quote that says, "Unity in a movement situation is overrated. If you were the establishment, which would you rather see coming in the door, 500 mice or one lion?" I was wondering if you could talk to practically how it functioned to have different people doing different things.
Okay, so, ACT UP, AIDS activism was a coalition that included the most elite and the most marginalized. And your social position determines your strategy. And that's true for community and it's true for individuals. So for example, if you were an ex-stockbroker or you had gone to Harvard and you were in ACT UP, you could communicate with the white men who at that time, it was all white men in power at the time, who were in pharmaceutical companies, who ran the government, who ran the media. We have stories of pharmaceutical companies inviting certain people from ACT UP to catered lunches to discuss whatever. But if you were women with HIV, or you were formerly incarcerated women with HIV, which was a constituency connected to ACT UP, or you didn't have that. You didn't have someone that you went to Yale with who you could call who ran a pharmaceutical company. So when ACT UP ran a 4-year campaign to try to force the CDC, and they succeeded, in changing the definition of AIDS so that women could get benefits and get admission to experimental drug trials. That 4-year campaign was incredibly messy. I mean, people had to break into people's offices and put stuff in their files and get arrested and scream at people and be inappropriate. Or for example, the former and active drug users in ACT UP who were trying to get needle exchange in New York. At the beginning, drug users were not allowed in experimental drug trials. Fauci, who now is supposed to be the big hero or whatever, he was in power back then. And when he was confronted by a drug user in ACT UP about why drug users weren't allowed in experimental drug trials, he said, well, they're not reliable. And ACT UP was like, well, you can't just write off an entire class of people and condemn them to death. So that was the governmental attitude. So what they did was they illegally exchanged needles in order to get arrested so that they could have a trial and take the very high risk strategy that they might win, and they did win, and made needle exchange legal in New York. So these three constituencies were all in the same organization, but they had to play it extremely differently. And because the organization had a radical democracy structure, you could. So if you had an idea and I didn't like it, I wouldn't try to stop you from doing it, I just wouldn't do it. And I would get other people to do my idea. So you could do your idea, and then I could do my idea, and they would happen simultaneously. And it turned out that this allowed for so many different kind of responses going on at exactly the same time in all these different social milieu and using all these different aesthetics and different kinds of political strategies, that's what created the paradigm shift. And I think historically, movements that have tried to force people to all agree on one analysis or one strategy, I would say have all failed, and I don't think there's a single exception to that. Because people can only be where they're at, and that's a really hard thing to accept in life and also in politics. But if you agree with somebody on one thing, work with them on that, and they're going to disagree with you about other things, and you just have to go with it. Especially now, because we really need Big Tent politics. There's so many different kinds of people under attack right now, and you can't demand that people agree with your whole agenda. And I think ACT UP really proves that.
That's great. Last question, or we'll end. No? Oh, just a wave. Well, thank you, Sarah.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Much.
Thank you so much.